To begin with, I propose a riddle. Name a country that is home to almost 50 different species of snakes, 22 species of spiders, 3 species of wasps, as well as a large number of different jellyfish, centipedes, and scorpions. Every year, about 3,500 people are hospitalized due to the bites of this dangerous fauna. Of course, we are talking about Australia, the most unusual and dangerous continent, where it seems that all life wants to kill you. But how were these lands discovered? Where did the Australians fight during World War II? And who owns Australia today? In the next few minutes, we will try to answer these and other questions. Let's start with the discovery of this mainland. Some historians believe that the Portuguese Cristóvão Mendes was the discoverer of Australia, but in fact this is not entirely true. We will talk about it a little later. First, let's go back to about 50,000 years ago, when the first ancestors of the Australian Aborigines appeared. These ancient people arrived in Australia by sea at a time when New Guinea and Tasmania were part of one large continent. It was they who became the earliest sea travelers in the world and settled the continent about 45,000 years ago. Many millennia later, the Portuguese navigator Cristóvão Mendes went to Asia on a trading mission. However, in 1521, Captain Van de Mendoza, on orders from above, decided to go in search of an island with gold from Asia. Gathering his old crew, he set out for a hypothetical destination where historians believe he miraculously found land and landed on the west coast of Australia. As proof of this event, we can cite 2 bronze cannons, presumably of Portuguese manufacture, which were found at the beginning of the 16th century. A few years ago, in 1916, at the alleged landing site of the Mendoza expedition. Nothing is known about the further fate of the participants in this journey, but according to some indirect evidence, the ship was able to safely reach the Cape of Good Hope. However, after that, his trail is finally lost. About 100 years later, at the beginning of the 17th century, the navigator Pedro de Quiros also set out in search of the southern continent. Over the next 365 days, his team managed to discover several small islands in southern Polynesia. Once, while staying on one of the inhabited islands, travelers heard from local residents about the existence of several dozen small islands to the south of them, beyond which there is a large land. Upon learning of this, the captain gave the order to sail the next day, and following the indicated coordinates, their team was the first to notice a large piece of land. This was immediately reported by the captain of the Irish ship, who suggested that they had reached the southern mainland and called this land Australia of the Holy Spirit. However, it later turned out that the brave Portuguese captain was not a particularly experienced navigator, and his discovery of Australia turned out to be just a small archipelago, which was later called the New Hebrides. This became clear after the arrival of the 2 captains who accompanied Theros on this expedition. Next, we move on to Holland, which actively participated in the discovery of Australia. In November 1605, the ship began sailing under the command of Willem Janssen. Bypassing the northern islands of Kai and Aru, the ship reached the southern coast of New Guinea, previously unknown to the Dutch. Janssen named it Marshy Land and traced the coastline for 400 kilometers. Then he turned to the southeast, crossed the central part of the Arabian Sea, and suddenly saw the coast. It was Australia. In May 1606, the Dutch made the first documented European landing on the Australian continent. During the landing, the travelers came into contact with the Australian Aborigines, and a fight immediately broke out between the parties, as a result of which several people were killed. Continuing north, the sailors traced and mapped the coast of the Cape York Peninsula almost to its northern tip. However, the Dutch exploration of Australia was not over. In 1622, the Feather and Arkham ships, commanded by Jan Carstens, set out to explore the waters off the coast of northwestern and northern Australia. In general, the voyage could be considered a success, with the exception of a short landing off the coast of New Guinea, where the Dutch encountered hostile natives, resulting in the death of 10 sailors, including Captain Arkham. By April 2012, land appeared again on the horizon, and it was Australia. Surprisingly, the local natives were quite friendly. The coast of northwestern Australia, according to the captain, was characterized in his report as the most barren on Earth. The Dutch were not even able to find enough fresh water in this area. In addition, the expedition's flagship, the Feather, was damaged, and Carstens assigned the new Captain Arkham to complete the exploration of the coast. He himself turned north and safely reached the Moluccas. Meanwhile, Cold Star, moving south, managed to reach the Gulf of Carpentaria, taking advantage of the favorable southeast monsoon. He then turned to the northwest and, following this course, discovered a large peninsula, which was later named after his ship, the Arnhem Peninsula. By the way, today in this territory in Australia is the Kakadu National Park. 20 years later, the East India Company, a giant corporation, showed interest in exploring Australia. However, each ship sent by them, one by one, died off the coast of Australia. That is why it was necessary to explore this territory far and wide. At the head of a new journey stood Abel Tasman. This expedition became significant in history, because not only was New Zealand discovered, which later gave us 6 great films about The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but also the island of Tasmania, which for almost 150 years was considered a peninsula. Unfortunately, Tasman's first expedition did not discover anything of importance to the East India Company. Therefore, almost immediately after returning home, Abel Tasman gathered the old team and again set off meticulously to explore the coast of Australia. Travelers mapped almost 5,500 kilometers of coast and found that all the lands previously discovered by the Dutch are parts of a single mainland. However, the data obtained only confirmed the East India Company in the complete futility of studying and exploring Australia. Therefore, the Dutch ceased to claim these lands. 120 years later, the British entered the race to explore Australia. The first official step in this direction was a round-the-world expedition under the command of an experienced naval sailor, James Cook. Interestingly, the official goal of the expedition was to study the passage of Venus through the disk of the Sun. However, in secret orders received by Cook, he was ordered immediately after the completion of astronomical observations to go to the southern latitudes in search of the so-called southern continent. Also, the purpose of the expedition was to determine the shores of Australia, especially its eastern coast, which until that time had not been explored. Everything went quite well, and Cook made a detailed map of the coastline of the future Australia. On August 22, 1770, the captain, on behalf of King George III, solemnly proclaimed this land a possession of Great Britain and named it New South Wales. From this time begins the colonial history of Australia. In 1778, on the southeastern coast of Australia, near Botany Bay, the city of Sydney was founded as a penal colony. However, a full-scale study of new lands was problematic due to the lack of sufficient support on the mainland. The first 2 bulls and 4 cows brought to Australia through an oversight were lost, and only in 1795 a herd of 40 well-fed cattle was discovered, which testified to the excellent pastures in Australia. The first group of free settlers from England arrived in 1793. However, until the middle of the 19th century, their proportion among Europeans in Australia was small. Thus began the gradual settlement of the continent. The British colony included not only Australia and New Zealand, but also Tasmania, the settlement of which began in 1803. In the early 19th century, the British discovered the strait separating Tasmania from Australia. In 1814, navigator Matthew Flinders suggested that the southern mainland be called Australia. And in 1827, the government of England officially announced the establishment of British sovereignty over the entire continent. The center of the British presence was the southeast coast of the mainland with the islands. The arrival of Europeans in Australia proved detrimental to the local Aborigines. They were driven away from water sources and hunting grounds. Many natives died of hunger, thirst, or were killed in clashes with white settlers. Others died from diseases introduced by the Europeans. Aboriginal people were used as cheap labor on the ranches of white settlers in the interior. In the middle of the 19th century, the remaining indigenous population was moved, partly on a voluntary basis, partly involuntarily, to missions and reservations. By 1921, the total number of Aboriginal people in Australia had decreased to 60,000 people, while at the very beginning of the development of the continent, there were about 300,000 local people. Thus, the exploration and colonization of Australia led to serious consequences for the indigenous population, the Aborigines, and greatly changed their way of life and culture. The strongest event for the continent was the Gold Rush, which began in 1851. This led to a massive influx of migrants from the UK, Ireland, other European countries, North America, and China. For 9 years, the population of the colonies has almost tripled, from 400,000 to 1,200,000 inhabitants. This created the prerequisites for the development of self-government. The first Australian territory to secede completely from the British Empire was New South Wales in 1855. This happened after the uprising in the goldfields of Victoria, where the rebels demanded universal suffrage and the abolition of special permits for gold mining. Gradually, other parts of the mainland gained independence, and trade unions of urban and agricultural workers began to form, which fought for better working conditions. Australia became the first country where skilled workers achieved the establishment of an 8-hour day. Uniform postal rules were adopted here, armed forces were created, and all this contributed to the acceleration of the country's economic development. In 1911, construction began on the new capital of Canberra, and between the First and Second World Wars, Australia received some territories from Great Britain, such as Norfolk Island, Ashmore and Cartier Islands, as well as claims to the Australian Antarctic Territory. In World War II, Australia fought as a member of the British Commonwealth on two fronts: in Europe against Germany and Italy, and in the Pacific against Japan. Although Japan was unable to carry out a ground invasion of Australian territory, it constantly threatened to invade, and Japanese aircraft bombed cities in the north of the country. After the Second World War, the Australian government began a massive program to receive immigrants from Europe. Between 1948 and 1975, 2 million new residents arrived in Australia, and since 1973 a significant influx of Asian immigrants began, which significantly changed the demographic and cultural life of the country. In 1986, the last constitutional link between Australia and the UK was severed by passing a law that removed the power of the British Parliament to make laws for Australia. In this way, Australia gained complete control over its constitutional documents. All these events became important moments in the history of Australia. The 2000 Olympic Games, where there was an emphasis on the country's indigenous population, also became a significant event. Today, Australia is actively working to mitigate the differences between the indigenous population and visiting guests. In recent years, work has been actively carried out to smooth out ethnic and cultural differences in order to achieve greater integration and justice for all residents of the country. Australia continues to develop and become an increasingly multinational and multi-ethnic country. Some secrets of the past may remain undiscovered, but the country continues to move forward, striving to create an equal and diverse society. Now you have a better understanding of the history and events that took place in Australia. This continent is rich in its unique history, culture, and nature. And who knows what the future holds for this amazing country.